We welcome you and thank you for joining us at today's recording of NDSP Connect. So NDSP Connect is a workshop forum for disability service providers. It's targeted towards Tasmania. We look forward to spending the next hour or so with you, sharing our knowledge and experiences as NDIS plan managers. We are answering your frequently asked questions that have been asked by you. So this is a recording of a workshop that we delivered live most recently. And so during that live forum, we did receive some questions and we did answer those. So now we're going back through and doing this recording so that people who are not able to attend live or who might be following up can actually access those resources and have them available. So this is why you can have those questions available, and here it is in the recorded format. So we're going to start today with an acknowledgement of country. So we wish to acknowledge and pay respect to the Tasmanian Aboriginal community as the traditional owners and continuing custodians of Lutruwita. We pay our respects to their elders, past and present, and acknowledge today's Tasmanian Aboriginal community that continue to care for country. So just do a brief introduction to ourselves. So I'm Josie, I'm your Regional Coordinator for Tasmania here at NDSP Plan Managers. I'm based in Hobart, and I also have a regional office up in the Northwest Coast based in West Ulverston. So from that space, I'm able to provide support all across the state. I'm travelling up there every month. So I provide support face-to-face to participants, providers and support coordinators. I'm very much supported by the rest of our team who operate nationally. Joining me here today, we have Mark and Shannon, who've worked in the processing and query space and really enjoy their time now that they've moved into their role as the dedicated resolutions team. They've been focusing on providing education surrounding plan management for providers and clients alike. Through that, they hope to ensure a seamless service with NDSP. We really want to ensure clients can utilise their plan to its full potential and develop strong relationships with providers. In that way, we can work together to best assist our clients. Do you wish to introduce yourselves?
Hi, I'm Shani. Mark.
Beautiful. Thank you. Most happy to have you on board and helping me here today in delivering this information.
Happy to be here.
So just going to go over some housekeeping. So given this is a recording, we don't need to go over any etiquette. We did do some case studies. We do ask that if you are presenting any information, and we did cover this in the case studies that we did, that they do remain anonymous. Tasmania is a close-knit community, and we do share many mutual participants in a close-knit network. So we do ask, if you're presenting questions to us at any time, whether it's in a follow-up email or a call, if they're regarding a mutual participant, you're most welcome to share details. But if it's just a case study you're presenting, that they do remain anonymous. And we do discuss case studies and scenarios based upon our experiences as plan managers in the sector, but we do not follow up on active resolutions regarding mutual clients throughout this workshop. But we have provided contact details if you do need to follow up with us. So if there is anything that you do find to be outstanding, then you can follow up for a confidential discussion with us, and we provide you all the means to do that. As a plan manager, NDSP works to support our participants to the best of their ability with the knowledge that is available to us. Given the ever-evolving nature of the NDIS, we recognise that the knowledge that we share and that we may have previously shared can be subject to change. At the end of today's session, we will provide you again the avenues to reach out to us with any follow-up or any queries. Again, these slides can be made available to you. So if you did wish to have a copy of these, if you are watching this recording, feel free to reach out to us during those. Excellent. We do want to preface, again, the pricing arrangements that we're referencing throughout this session as well are the ones effective as of March 1st, 2022. If you are watching this at a later time and there might be subject to changes, feel free to just reach out. We're happy to follow up with any further information as the NDIS evolves and changes. And throughout, we're going to be covering 6 topics. So they're going to be how to minimize payment delays when you're working with a plan manager and the top ways that you can ensure fast payment of invoices. Why are plan managers sometimes unable to provide the full picture around invoicing delays? What happens if a participant requests a refund from a provider where we are plan managing the budget? What are our risk management processes to support providers? What happens when there is an overspend? And then any common NDIS pricing arrangements confusion. So transport, provider travel and activity-based transport, as well as your other common queries. So those are going to be the main topics that we're going to cover throughout. And then following, we're going to just cover some of the other questions that were raised during the live session. Beautiful. So let's dive right into it with question 1. So how to minimize payment delays when working with plan managers and the top ways that you can ensure fast payment of invoices. So I'll hand it over to the team to pick up some of the talk in there. So is there a specific format plan managers would like to see invoices in?
Perfect. Thank you so much, Sophie. So yeah, there's sort of the NDA do have like minimum requirements sort of on an invoice, sort of as you can see on the screen there. So they need sort of like a unique invoice number so we don't get sort of any issues with like duplications or anything like that. We do need sort of obviously the client details, their full name first and last. The NDIS number is helpful, but a lot of providers may not actually have that NDIS number privy to them. We are needing the ABN number of the provider and the provider's name, their banking details to make sure we can obviously make sort of the right payment. And then sort of an invoice date on the invoice, so we know sort of when the invoice was issued, as well as the service dates of when the actual services were provided. So often if there's sort of more than a couple of hours of service, or if there was a service period, we want to make sure that we're billing the services on the right date, to make sure that it's all correct. And it's sort of a description of the services. So sometimes if you don't know the NDIS code, because I know the NDIS can be quite tricky with their coding, as long as there's a pretty sort of description, a pretty good description on the actual invoice next to the services, NDSP, we can sort of work out which code works best with that description if we believe there is enough information there. We do prefer it to be in a PDF document. That is like the easiest format that our system works with. Word documents can be sent through. We can sort of make that, we can make that conversion for you if it's just easier. A lot of providers will send it through on a Word document just in case there is a mistake. It's a lot easier to fix on a Word document than it is a PDF. As long as all of the sort of information and everything that was just mentioned is on that invoice, there shouldn't really be any issues. We do just really want to stress that the dot pages format, which is the format I believe for like the MacBooks, for like Apple, NDSP, we work on like a Windows software, so we're not actually able to open or access any of the dot pages formats. So yeah, more than welcome to just send it through as a PDF. That's like the main one we want to be seeing. Handwritten invoice is another one that we do accept as long as it is sort of like legible and we can work out exactly what the services were and all the information is correct. We do have an actual invoice template on our website under the participant toolbox that you can access at any time. Sometimes it's just easier to have it just, an editable PDF document rather than just a handwritten one, but we do accept them. And then I suppose, and a way to sort of reduce, any issues that may pop up is we really want to make sure that, yourself as providers are having conversations with your participants on, where to send your invoices, making sure it's going to the right, invoices email rather than one of the information email. And, just to really confirm like what budgets us as the plan manager actually do cover, what services we can actually pay for, rather than submitting an invoice through to us and then having to wait a business day for us to get back in touch with you to advise, unfortunately, we aren't able to make payment on this. You maybe reach out to the NDIS for it, or if it's potentially a self-managed budget, we want to reduce that amount of wait time for you to get paid, basically. Now, we've received like a few questions when you guys signed up as well. One of them that's linked in with this is sort of, is it if it's preferable to have invoices addressed directly to the plan manager with the client details included in the description of the services, or if it's to be addressed directly to the client. Absolutely, please have it addressed to the participant. When you send it through to us, it doesn't necessarily need to have sort of like 2 NDSP plan managers or anything like that, as long as it's come to the right email address. But we really need to make sure that the client's information is like that's very clearly stated on the invoice, so we know exactly who we are, processing the invoice against. Occasionally, we do have sort of parents and participants both with NDSP, and sort of the stressor on having the participants' details very clearly, because if the invoice is for the participant, but they've got the mum or dad's, details on it, addressing it to them, we're not sure who to bill it against. So we want to make sure if it's for the client, make sure it's very clearly addressed to them, so we know, it's definitely for them. And then how long should a provider be waiting sort of to follow up? Like, how long should a provider wait for payment before ringing and emailing us to follow up? So we do have our business terms are 3 to 5 business days, which is sort of allowing, enough time for us to receive the invoice, process it, wait that 2 days for, when we submit the invoice to the NDA, for them to then send us the funding and make payment. Given that there are no issues, with the invoice or with the client, so, if there is an invoice issue, if something was, billed against the wrong service date, there was an issue with the coding or the pricing, that 3 to 5 business days wouldn't quite cover that, because it does need to give us time to work out what has gone wrong and to reach out. Potentially, there could be some client issues. So if a participant is having their plan rebuilt, or if they're requiring, a movement of funds within their core budget to make payment, that is going to hold up sort of the slight delay on the payment. And some participants do prefer to have their invoices approved by them, from their providers. So that is obviously going to be like an extra day or so for us to send it off to them and then to get back to us. But again, that is something that can be covered sort of with the approvals if you're making that approval with your providers prior to submitting it to us. So when it's submitted to us, we know that it has been approved and we can just make payment on it, straight away. If you do reach sort of like payment day 4 and you haven't received any payment or any contact from NDSP regarding sort of any concern, we do recommend giving our sort of support centre team a call on sort of the 1-800 number. You can email if your preferred contact is an email, but we fear that if there was a problem, that email may not be responded to for 1 or 2 business days, which is only going to further delay sort of getting in touch with you potentially. So if you haven't received any contact or payment by day 4, do give us a call, and one of our, friendly team will be able to help you out and work out what's gone wrong there. Potentially just advising you that, the payment was an extra day late, but you are getting paid, which is sort of the, exactly what you want. And just the last thing is that our business terms of 3 to 5 days, that is business days. So like the weekend wouldn't be covered in that instance. So for example, if an invoice was submitting on a Friday afternoon, sort of after 3 p.m, it wouldn't be viewed until, that Monday sort of afternoon time. So Monday would then be that day 1 of the 3 to 5 business days. So it's just a really good, thing to keep in the back of your mind. When we say 3 to 5 business days, it is sort of the day after you submit would be that day 1. Yeah. Cool.
Cool. Thank you. So we'll move on to our second topic there. So why are plan managers sometimes unable to provide the full picture around invoicing delays?
Okay, so the main reason that we have why us as plan managers may not be able to give you a full picture around invoicing delays is confidentiality. So us as plan managers, we're bound by our responsibility to our participants to protect them and their details and their plans, as they may not always want that information shared with you. So we do require permission and consent to share with any information regarding our participants. So, we do recommend having those conversations with your participants so that they can share this correct information with you and keep you up to date regarding any reason for delays. We do endeavour to have the client contacted anytime there is a delay, so they're CC'd for transparency on all our threads, and if there's anything that sort of goes a little bit amiss, we do get in contact with them as well so that they have a very round picture of those things as well. So they should be able to give you the information that they're comfortable sharing in order to resolve it. Obviously, we will be able to discuss with you any invoicing problems so that you can have it rectified. But in regards to budgets, plan dates, things like that might be causing the delay, you would need to be discussing that with your participant or getting permission from them for us to discuss it with you.
Beautiful. Thank you. And then topic 3. So what happens in the event a participant would request a refund from a provider where we are plan managing the budget?
Okay, beautiful. Well, obviously, if NDSP do get a request for a refund from a participant, we'll obviously be checking the legitimacy of the request, make sure that, the services that were provided were legitimate, they were properly given, the invoicing is correct, everything's compliant. We'll investigate the reason for the request before doing so. As plan managers, we are able to make that request on behalf of the participant. But then obviously if a dispute is being made between participant and provider, we do recommend to directly contact the NDIA to resolve the dispute. Because we're only a financial medium, so we don't facilitate any disputes. So it's always best left with the NDIA if there isn't an agreement there for any kind of refund request.
Excellent. Thank you. So we'll move right along into our 4th topic. So what are our risk management processes that we would have in place to support our providers?
Oh, all right. So the main one that we sort of push on is that we want to make sure the invoices that we do receive are up to the NDA standards. So like the information that I just mentioned earlier, we want to make sure all of that information is on the invoices prior to processing, because if it's not, we potentially could be making a mistake because we're going off the information on the invoice. So if there's any sort of conflicting information on the invoices, like if a line item that has been provided is different or doesn't match the actual description of the supports, we would be then querying the provider and potentially the participant on what the actual supports were and educating them on, whether they need to correct the code or the description. So, when we're processing any invoices, if there are any conflicting information or anything like that, if they have, if a provider has submitted an invoice and the services they're billing for are actually over the approved rate that is set by the NDIS, we obviously are not processing any invoices if they do fall over, and then we would just be making contact with sort of the provider and participant, advising what the actual rate would be, and that the invoices need to be inclusive of that. If GST was charged on the invoices, as some services are sort of GST inclusive, the rate that is being charged, that GST has to fall under it. So the GST would be divided over the hours of service, and then that would be then, making sure that that doesn't pull over the rate. If it does, sort of, we won't be processing that one. And what that does is it protects sort of all parties involved, so the provider, the participant, and sort of NDSP ourselves. It protects all parties involved from sort of any sort of risk of an audit by the NDIA, for processing invoices incorrectly, missing information, charging over the rate, which just is flat out not allowed. So we're just really wanting to make sure that all parties involved are protected from any issues like that. And one thing that we do really stress as often as we can in a lot of our sort of conversations with people is we always recommend a service agreement between a provider and a participant, outlining the supports that are going to be provided and then how much the supports will be. Because what it's doing is it's essentially safeguarding that provider and the participant to make sure that that funding will be there for that sort of provider to be paid for their services. So like when NDSP receive a signed service agreement, which is signed by the client or an authorised representative of them, we as NDSP will actually allocate that funding within the participant's plan to that provider. So that provider can only access those funds, and if there's any sort of overlapping services with another provider, they will not be able to access that funding because we've locked it away. So what that does is it removes the fear or the risk of that provider not being able to be paid for their services. And sort of if any issues come up with that service agreement, or if the participant does want to sort of remove that service agreement, the provider is also advised of that and a conversation is had to make sure the provider is aware sort of that there's been a change and that funding is no longer safeguarded. And you'll be informed, like both the provider and participant will be informed when that funding has been set aside, but it is not up to NDSP as the plan manager to monitor the use of that funding. So that would be between the provider and the participant, and sort of organising their own supports. They've given us essentially a bulk amount of funding that they will be using over a period of time. That's what we will monitor. When that runs out, then that's it. But we also do not monitor the service agreement if a new pricing arrangement has been released. So if the rates, for example, recently have actually gone up, But the old service agreement is for the old rates. NDSP it's not our responsibility to be advising a provider that the rates have gone up and that, they can essentially bill more. So that would be up to them to organise with the participant and essentially have a brand new service agreement organised. But yeah, so that's sort of our risk management to make sure everything goes through quite smoothly.
Thanks, Mark. So another quite intricate question, but what happens in the event of an overspend?
All right, so this one is sort of quite a broad one, and we did receive a few questions when you guys sort of got your tickets. You were submitting a few questions when you were signing up. So one of them was, we want to be having discussions, about potential overspends by our clients and resolutions around overspends, and sort of what measures are in place to reduce the chance of an overspend, and sort of like our duties around like low budgets. So NDSP, we do have sort of check-ins with our client engagement team, essentially when a participant signs up. So we've got it 2 weeks after they sign up, 4 months in, 8 months in, and then another 8 weeks prior to the end of their plan. And what this does is the client engagement team check in to see how that participant is using their funding, whether potentially they may be overspending, which then leads to sort of budget alerts that sit with different teams within NDSP, where we will be in contact with participants and their authorised nominees, just to check in, make sure they're aware, potentially recommending sort of an early plan review if there is going to be an overspend. Sometimes there's a change of circumstance that, no one sees coming, especially when a plan was built. And what that does is it just makes sure that NDSP, we're not processing invoices right up until the last minute when there's no funding and, a provider then finds out that there's none, a participant, isn't organised for a plan review or anything and is sort of shocked to hear that they don't have any funding. So, we want to make sure that check-ins and budget alerts are submitted and, conversations are had with both provider and participant. Of course, there is that confidentiality side as well, that a participant may not want a provider aware that sort of they're running low on funding or anything like that, in fear that the provider will, stop services when the funding is running low. So it is up to the participant or their authorised nominee to sort of essentially confirm or deny if NDSP are allowed to sort of relay that information to a provider. But again, that is a conversation that then that provider and participant could have together, removing NDSP, completely. And as mentioned, we always do recommend organising the service agreements because that does essentially reduce, quite heavily reduce the risk of an overspend. If we, when NDSP receive that service agreement, we know how much funding is going to be used for that provider. So we can see, oh yeah, they will be using this much, and which will leave X amount remaining until the end of the plan, or potentially the provider has a service agreement to the end of the plan, which means we know that there's going to be funding to pay for it, which is grand. And what we also have is we have a $10,000 approval system sort of with NDSP. So if we do receive invoices that are over $10,000, it goes to a specific team who just check over the invoice and just check over the participant's funding to make sure that $10,000 or more is not going to be a huge chunk of funding, and to make sure that, if another invoice is received and another one after that, if the plan can retain such large chunks of funding being removed at a time. Often these do spark budget alerts just to make sure, potentially the funding won't last the entire plan. Let's discuss this, let's work out what we can do, what time period, you'll really be needing to go for review and things like that. And then one of the questions we received was, what processes do we have in place so that the client hasn't overcommitted themselves to services outside of their funding budgets? So like with the check-ins and the budget alerts, we have plan utilisation conversations with participants and authorised nominees on whether or not their plan will actually sustain the services that they're looking to receive. What that also does is, if they know, I potentially want to be seeing, my physiotherapist 3 times a week, this is the rate that it's going to be, this is how much it's going to cost a week, per month, per year, and then this is the expected cost, for the duration of your plan. So with that utilisation conversation, we can work out with the participant or their nominee how much funding they're predicting to be used and how much wiggle room they're going to have, especially when a plan is quite new, because it does leave the participant with that time period where they can, request sort of like an unscheduled plan review, or just, again, like an urgent plan review to say, look, I've looked over what I'm going to be requiring and it's not matching up. We're sort of jumping the gun basically, and making sure before we get too far into it, we can make sure that that participant is not going to overcommit themselves for their services. Another question was, are providers able to obtain consent from the plan nominee to liaise with the plan manager to ascertain if there is sufficient funding for us as a provider to use, and then the visibility of total amount of funding in a plan. So does the plan manager receive a notification if there's an increase or decrease in funding? So providers are able to obtain that sort of consent to speak with plan managers around those queries. However, it does need to be either verbally or sort of like a written authorization from the client or the nominee that we can disclose that information with them. A provider can sort of have that conversation and obtain that consent with the client, but at some point NDSP will need to be advised either verbally by the participant or, you know, written by email by the participant to say, yeah, that's fine, you can have that discussion. You know, it just keeps things quite transparent, and but that is of course completely up to the client if they're happy to do that. And plan managers, we actually only have access to view the spending in the budgets that are plan managed, and we aren't able to see any of the agency managed spending or self-managed spending. When we receive a participant's plan, if the participant does send it to us, we can view all of the funding that was given to that participant and their agency managed budgets, but we have no way of tracking it as the plan goes on. We can only see the plan managed funding. And unfortunately, we don't receive any notification if there was an increase or a decrease in the participant's funding, which can be quite troublesome sometimes. The NDIS are a little bit secretive with that. So if a participant sort of has received, you know, an injection of funding, we won't actually notice that unless we're having to go into that participant's funding on the MyPlace portal to have a look whether they need to move some funds around, or, you know, because there is that 90-day grace period after a participant's plan ends. We are not advised by the NDIS if they have then potentially zeroed out that funding in that budget. So unfortunately, we would love to receive a notification, but we unfortunately don't. And yes, one of the last questions was, you know, alerting providers when funding is exhausted, and why do we not advise them earlier, sort of that the funding is running low, and sort of invoices can't be paid, you know, because there's no funding. So unless the provider has actually obtained sort of that approval that was just mentioned with the plan manager about funding with the participant, we're only able to advise the provider when the funding sort of is not sufficient to pay their invoice, because any other conversation prior to that would then there'd be a breach of confidentiality, you know, on NDSP's on NDSP's side. Only once the funding is exhausted, you know, NDSP could then make contact with the provider and say, look, unfortunately, there is only this much to make payment on the invoice. And then we'll go from there. If a participant's plan is current, ideally conversations would already been had with that participant to state they need to go for a review because their funding is not going to last. If the plan has expired and there just is not sufficient funding, what NDSP can do is we can submit the invoices to the NDIA provider payments team for consideration of payment, but that is only after a participant's plan has expired and there is not sufficient funding to make payment on their invoices. Provider payments is a little bit of a tricky space though, so if you do have any questions or, you know, any questions or concerns, please feel free to give us a call, and we are more than happy to run it through with you and sort of get a better understanding of what goes down.
So we're on to our final topic, and this topic does cover a few. So we did get a number of like common queries, lots of questions around travel and transport. So we'll kind of touch on those and some other common queries. So we'll just kind of go through all of those in one topic now.
Beautiful. So one of our common questions was what happens with claiming when a participant passes away. So for any services or invoices dated after a participant has passed will need to be submitted to the NDIA to be considered for payment, because we can't process anything past the date of a participant passing. And it's not always black and white. There won't be any services after, but there's often rental that needs to be wrapped up or support coordination. So there is work sometimes that does need to be done after a participant passes away. So those kinds of invoices such as rental or wrapping up things or advising their other providers, those services will need to be approved by the NDIA to take from that plan, because obviously it will be dated after. So for anything such as that, we do recommend having conversations with a planner or the NDIA to be able to see what funding can be utilised for those services. But unfortunately, once the service booking is closed, we're unable to process anything from that day forward. Beautiful. So school leavers employment funding and supported independent living information is very well sought after, but it's typically tailored to each participant individually in their plans. So when their plan gets built, no two are the same. They are quite tailored. So what we would do is, if you have any questions regarding school leavers employment or any SIL or STA or anything like that, we would recommend contacting us for a one-on-one conversation regarding that tailored information, because we'll be able to break it down for you a little bit easier. It's kind of hard to give a broad bit of information there because it is so tailored. So if you do have any information that you want from us, just give us a call and we'll be able to sort of identify that for you.
Yeah, onto a hot topic for you there. Over transport and travel.
Yeah, one of our main questions that we've received for the forum and outside of the forum as well is a bit of a transport breakdown in the core budgets. So there are quite a few different support line items within core to claim for different types of travel and transport for participants and for providers as well. So I'm just going to go through a little bit of a breakdown just to give everyone a bit more of a rounded picture on what can be used for each support code. So I'll start with transport in the O2 budget. So that's the budget specifically popped into core for transport. Now that is typically only to be used for independent participant travel. So for work or appointments, so anywhere that they're going independently. Taxis and Ubers, public transport are the most common uses for that. It often gets paid in instalments to participants from the NDIA, but if it is plan managed, they will, they'll do the travel and they'll go to work and they'll go to their appointments and they'll claim it back from their plan. So that's normally how O2 is used, and it shouldn't be billed for any provider travel or aligned with any other services. It should really only be for independent travel there. So I hope that clears that one up a little bit. And then we have activity-based transport, which typically comes from your O4 budget. It's to be used when supporting a participant or transporting a client to and from a support with a support worker. So it needs to be billed per kilometre travelled. So I've just popped an example in there as well. So if you're travelling 15 kilometres with your participant at 85 cents per kilometre, then you would be billing for $12.75, and that's always how it is billed. It's not billed for time. For most travel, 85 cents is a recommended price a provider should be charging. It's pretty reasonable unless it is otherwise agreed upon with a client and popped into a service agreement. So it can be discussed, but that's recommended. And then we've got provider travel. So there's labour and non-labour costs for provider travel. So I'll start with non-labour costs. Again, these lines are for kilometres travelled to and from services. So it's for any non-labour costs just to run your vehicle. So for road tolls, parking fees, and things like that. So again, 85 cents is a reasonable price that you can be charging, but you can discuss it again with your client and get it popped into a service agreement. And then we have labour costs for provider travel. So that is for time travelled to and from. So you can use your same code as the service that you're providing. So I've popped an example just up there. So if you're giving a social support and you're travelling to the participant and it takes you 15 minutes, you would use the quantity of 15 minutes and that maximum hourly rate that you would charge for that same support. So you can claim up to 30 minutes of time travelled in metro areas, and then a little bit further out it's an hour, but then for remote costs, those can be discussed with participants, because obviously when you're living remote and very remote, that can be a very, very, very far distance to be travelling. So that's why it is something that can be discussed and agreed upon with the participant. So hopefully that breakdown will give sort of a bit more of a round picture on how travel can be charged. But again, if you're having some specific issues or you're still a little bit unsure, again, you can give us a call and give us your situation, and we'll be more than happy to break it down for you and how, you know, billing can be appropriately sent through so that your invoice is compliant straight away. It is a very common question that we deal with, so we're more than happy to help out as well with that.
Amazing. Thanks, Shannon. So we've just listed there some of our references that we've used throughout the coverage of those past 6 topics. And these can be really resourceful for anybody who's watching. So referring to the pricing arrangements, the plan management guidelines, that's just going to provide an overview of our roles and responsibilities as plan managers. And then at NDSP, we also have a specific participant toolbox that's available. And those are just an overview of what's included in there. But we'll now we'll jump into some questions that kind of came up throughout when we did the live recording or the live session. We had a lot of questions that kind of came through the chat or in a general discussion. So we'll take this opportunity to kind of go through those questions and answer those, just to make sure that anybody who is watching a recording of this session can then also get those answers too. So we'll move ahead into that. So one of the questions that we had, and this is more around, so what would happen if a participant overcommits with a provider? For example, a client has $35,000 in their NDIS plan and signs an agreement with providers totaling $50,000.
Cool. So if we were to receive that service agreement, none of that funding obviously would be able to be quarantined because it is larger than the available funding for that participant. A conversation would definitely be had with that participant, you know, to discuss, or their nominee, sort of to discuss why or how that has come about, you know, what the discussion with their provider was to state, you know, how did they, you know, have $50,000 worth of services that they're wanting to commit to when they've only got 35 in their budget. So it would sort of fall almost on top of a plan utilisation call as well, because we would be wanting to go through what they're actually trying to receive and how much funding it's going to cost. You know, potentially the provider has organised a service agreement with the participant outside of the plan date. So if the provider wasn't privy to the actual end date of the participant's plan and their service agreement goes beyond that date, that funding might make sense, but NDSP will only be able to organise the service agreement, you know, up until the end date of that participant's plan. And then after that, if the participant, you know, wishes to continue with NDSP, we would just have a new service agreement that the participant and provider would organise with the brand new dates on it for the new plan, which, you know, potentially will have that excess of like $15,000 in that query. That might then fall, you know, into that new plan. So the funding was correct, it just, you know, wasn't right for that participant's plan. But yeah, so definitely would be having conversations with both provider, participant, authorised nominee, making sure, you know, how they got there, how we can sort of revert them back in the right way, and yeah, get the service agreement correct and underway.
And then tying back to our conversation around refunds, what would happen in the event that a participant is adamant that they would like a refund, but the provider is adamant that the payment is deserved? So where would NDSP or any other plan manager sit in this event?
So again, we obviously investigate legitimacy for any refund request, whether it's a provider or a participant or any nominee, anyone. We'll make sure that, you know, the services haven't been doubled up on, or, you know, whatever reason that the participant has given for the refund request, we will make sure that we investigate all avenues there, and we can make them request. But obviously, if a participant is adamant they want a refund, but the provider is saying that the payment is legit, then we will recommend that they contact the NDA and file that formal dispute with them. Any refund request will become paused until a resolution is reached through the NDIA. We make the request, and then obviously once it goes to the NDIA, we will leave it as it is. And then obviously if an outcome is reached with the NDIA, which is the goal, we'll then act upon the outcome. So we'll action that accordingly once we hear back. But as we are a financial medium, we do recommend that all disputes do go to the NDIA, as it will be resolved appropriately.
Perfect. And if a provider were to purchase an item for a client, is there an ideal way that they can show what this item is? As in, is it just the name of the product, or is there more information where it's required, like where is it from?
Yeah, so sort of the best way we would say to do it is to send it through as a reimbursement with the actual receipt of what the item is. So, if you're purchasing an item, for example, from Coles, you would be receiving that receipt and, make sure you, keep hold of it, because we would need a copy of that, because we would need to see exactly what the item is. Just a name of the product would not be sort of sufficient, because we would need to know where it's being purchased from, how much, it actually cost. Because potentially, more information may be required, and that would just be a conversation that NDSP would be having with the participant or their authorised nominee. If justification or any kind of reasonable necessary is needed to be organised to make sure we can pay it and make sure it's okay. If you do want to go through a provider to have items purchased for you, that is also fine. The provider will need to send an invoice with all of the information, the same as what a reimbursement would be or what you would see on a receipt. It would need to be the same information, stating how many were being purchased, what the actual item is, the cost of it, if there was any GST involved. And then, because it would be an invoice, we would need to make sure the invoice then contains the banking information and the ABN of the provider, participant's name, dates of the invoice and everything like that. Yeah, if you're going for reimbursement, attaching the receipt is absolutely best practice. If there's no support lines included, just on the receipt, for example, if it's from Coles, they don't have NDIS support lines on them. We need to know exactly where the item is, so we know as a plan manager where to, invoice that invoice from.
And on top of that as well, by attaching the full receipt, if you are a provider that is purchasing an item for a client, we can then also have that proof of payment from that receipt itself, because obviously to reimburse any funding that has been spent for a client, we do need to have that proof of payment before we are able to reimburse. So just by sending the full receipt as clear as you can, we will have all of that information there, and there won't be any delays on the payment.
Excellent. So our next question, it came across in two parts. So we'll start with the first part. So when we action a quarantine of funds, what would happen in the event that an NDIS plan auto extends and the quarantine amount had not been depleted? So does the allocation roll on or does it void?
Yeah, so with the service agreement, in order for NDSP to, quarantine that funding, the service agreement would have to have a start date of when they want that funding to begin. And generally, in sort of a general sense, it is the end date of the plan. So if that plan does auto extend and, 6 months or a year is added onto the plan, that service agreement was only valid and, the funds quarantined from that end date of the plan. So essentially, if we're trying to invoice or process any invoices with service dates that fell within that original service agreement time, that funding would be quarantined. If that provider's then tried to, if they didn't organise a new that service agreement or anything, and we tried to process, it would not be coming from that pool of funding that was quarantined, because it is outside of those dates. So if there is an auto extension and we do have service agreements for, providers for that participant, we would be speaking with the participant and the providers, advising, there has been a rollover. If the participant is happy to advise the provider of that, of course, and just stating, that service agreement has ended essentially on this date. That funding is still quarantined up until that date, but we would recommend them organising a new service agreement with the new updated dates, to make sure that the funding is then going to be safeguarded, for the full duration of the new plan, or the plan extension, I should say. And yeah, what we want to do, when we find out that there has been an extension on a participant's plan, we replicate that on our NAPA portal system. So on the MyPlace portal with the NDIS, we would, unfortunately, we don't get an alert to say there has been an extension, but we would go in to that sort of MyPlace portal to essentially rebuild that participant's plan, find out that it hasn't been rebuilt, it's just been extended. We'd be like, awesome, update the dates, update the, the funding, and then, replicate it on our NAPA, which is then when we would generally see if there's service agreements in place that we need to sort of organise and get fixed up. Yeah.
Part of that question was, so then a quarantined amount can still just be used after the extension for ongoing invoices.
So the quarantine amount can still be used, but only for service dates prior to the extension. So as Mark said, anything that's past that rollover or that extension date would need to be, acknowledged in the service agreement. So we always would recommend to have an extended service agreement sent through to us so that we can extend the dates there. We would contact the participant, let them know, or if they're on top of it, they will have a new service agreement submitted to us with their extended dates, and that way we can implement it on the system.
Yeah, Yeah, so like generally a provider, if they have organised a service agreement, because they've got that end date, the service agreement will be for services until that date. And generally, because the participant will go for a plan review, you know, that participant may be meeting with the client to then discuss, hey, this is how our services have gone. You know, if it's a recommendation that you need more, then a new service agreement then, you know, would be organised, because that service agreement, you know, by that end date would have been fulfilled and the funding ideally would have then been utilised.
So often it's treated like a new plan anyway, because it's been a duplication of funding. It might not always be a duplication of services, because their circumstances could have changed despite the extension. So we always treat it like a new set of dates anyway. So it would have to be discussed.
Another question, if you see funding may become exhausted, do you only advise participants, or is anyone else notified? For example, a support coordinator or a nominee, or does a participant generally speak with providers following the advice that is given from NDSP?
Yeah, so our first point of contact would be the participant or their authorised nominee. You know, if we're only contacting the participant, we want to make sure that sort of they're receiving support from their nominee or their support coordinator. You know, because we don't want to essentially call a participant and say, hey, unfortunately, there isn't, you know, sufficient funding to pay this invoice, because it can be quite a shock to somebody, especially if they're not the one that is sort of managing their funding. So yeah, we will be notifying the participant or their authorised nominee generally before an actual plan has, you know, become exhausted, because we want to make sure that, you know, if they do need to go for a plan review, there is that time period where they're not going to be left without money, or left without money in their plan, and then services, you know, if they're still receiving services, you know, no payment can be made on them. You know, we do recommend the participant get in contact with their providers directly and explain, sort of, as a plan manager, we cannot sort of discuss that information with them. So if the participant wants us to discuss, you know, any of the information with their provider, they would need to sort of advise us that we can do that. And yeah, so occasionally participants prefer to liaise directly with their providers, and, you know, they would give us consent and discuss remaining budgets, you know, available funding, next steps and stuff. But yeah, that consent would need to be obtained by NDSP for that.
Going back to, in the event that there is an overspend, so would it be possible for a provider to make a submission to provider payments as opposed to the plan manager?
So unfortunately, if a participant is plan managed, the NDIA generally only speak with a plan manager on behalf, not with the provider. It's because the funding is managed by the plan managers that any payment being made, if approved, is sent back to a plan manager to give out to the providers. So as the provider isn't in charge of that funding, they can't make the submission. So generally what happens is that we will submit on behalf of the client, and then obviously any resolution that comes through to us, we'll then give out and, you know, talk about a resolution and results and things like that. Upon submission by NDSP as a plan manager, we receive a submission ID, which we relay to the client and the provider, so that if they have a query, as the provider payments process can take quite a bit of time, if they want an update or they want a query, they can quote the submission ID number and we can find out what's going on behalf of them instead.
When doing a provider payment submission, what evidence would help support that submission and hopefully a successful submission?
Absolutely. So essentially, before we make any kind of provider payment submission, essentially, if we do need to make a submission, it's because the participant has not got enough funding in the plan, which the NDIA sort of, when the plan is made, they predict this is how much funding will be used. If we're needing to make a submission, more funding has been used, than given. So we would be wanting to obtain any kind of documentation that states any reasoning for the overspend. For example, if a participant sort of had a fall, which then eventuated into them requiring more support, their plan obviously didn't predict them having a fall or an injury, so the funding is not going to be reflective of those circumstances. A change of circumstance explanation is really helpful. Often we're in contact with the providers or the support workers because they're the ones that are working with the participant, the most. You know, if they've got sort of notes on shifts or, you know, for example, hospital discharge papers, you know, OT recommendations or anything like that, that information is really helpful because it essentially is just highlighting to the NDIS what's happened. And these are the reasons why the participant has sort of spent more than the allocated amount. And also, when a participant goes for their plan review and does receive that new plan, hopefully that information is also advised, you know, to the NDIS in that review meeting, because it would be advising like this is what's happened and we may need, you know, additional funding in the new plan to make up for that. You know, within the evidence, it's really important to consider and like highlight the risk, you know, of what would have happened with the participant if they did not receive that additional support. So, you know, all three of those, you know, reasons for overspend, a change of circumstance, and sort of, you know, showing the real risk if that participant didn't receive that service, what, you know, potentially could have happened. So we, you know, try and obtain all of that before we make the submission, so we give them the best chance of receiving a payment, because it is essentially up to the NDIS. If they do get back to us and say, you know, that information was not sufficient, we would then reach out to, you know, participant, authorised nominee, you know, OT, support workers, anything like that, to try and just get more information, because we can always make a separate, like a second submission to try again.
Excellent. So coming back to travel, so for non-labour provider travel, can providers just add the cost of parking, so not by kilometre, but the fixed parking cost separate to the kilometres?
Okay, beautiful. So parking would still fall under that non-labour cost of provider travel. So even if it is a fixed sum, so you've spent $10 on parking, still allocate it accordingly under the provider travel non-labour costs as that line item. So the best way to bill is to be clear with dollar value, as the NDIA in the pricing arrangements, it does have a notional value of $1. So the best way to do it is say, you know, you write provider travel non-labour costs, include the code if you would like, pop the parking fee there, and then put a total of $7 on the invoice. So that's the best way to do it. Keep it all within that code, and then that way your invoice will stay compliant.
Excellent. And so then if a participant has any queries or concerns with their budget, can they get in contact with us at NDSP?
Absolutely, they can. So we recommend, if you're going to have sort of that, or you're wanting that conversation, you know, our team is contactable on sort of the 1-800 number, or if they prefer sort of an email as their method of contact, because, you know, on a phone call, it can be quite easy to get lost sort of in what, you know, is being explained. If they prefer to email, we do have the info@ndsp.com.au email that they can, you know, send off their questions to, and our support services team, you know, can then, you know, reach out to them, respond in an email and let them know sort of all their concerns, or like at least try and fix them for them. We do sort of include information on underspend strategies as well, you know, to try and, you know, offer creative solutions for reaching plan goals if the participant is unsure how to use their funding. Essentially, that is what we try and do in plan utilisation conversations as well. It's not just this is how, you know, we can, you know, recognise that this may be an overspend, but let's also, you know, let's work out how we can, you know, creatively work out a solution that, you know, you can underspend, and then, you know, you have essentially no hiccups during the plan period. But yeah, absolutely can get in contact with us. We've got, you know, a lovely support services team who are more than happy to have those conversations with you.
And I think it's really important to highlight, because I mean, throughout this content that we've delivered, but also in a lot of our conversations that we have day to day, we quite often have topics of conversation that come up around overspend, or you know, this budget is going to exhaust, and this and this. But we do have you know, there is participants who are accessing the NDIS, and commonly here in Tasmania, who are, you know, have significant underspends. So that's where, you know, when engaged with a plan manager and went through NDSP, they are able to, you know, get information and resources around getting that utilisation happening. So, you know, we'll support through an overspend, but then also, you know, encourage spending in that, you know, in the instance that there is an underspend. So popping strategies in place, explaining the budgets, you know, really building that capacity through the capacity building piece that we are funded to provide. So yeah, and
yeah, that's right.
Amazing. So that kind of concludes the rest of the questions that we had received throughout that session. Have popped up on the slide there, so how you can get in contact with us. So if you're watching this recording and you're thinking, oh, that was excellent, hopefully we answered all your questions, but you might have other questions that might have popped up that we didn't answer, or you were unable to attend the live session, then this is our contact information. So that's myself here, Regional Coordinator for Tassie. So my email and my phone number, as well as the operational team. So that's their contact number. So that's how you can get in contact with our support services, our client engagement, our provider payments, our provider invoicing queries team. They're all there, ready to answer your questions as well. So that's the contact information. I just wanted to highlight some of the other resources that we did have available through our website as well. So if it is of interest and you are looking for an answer or a resource, just something to go over, whether for your own general knowledge or for your participants' knowledge or someone that you're supporting. So these are some of our buckets of funding, travel and transport. So these are flyers, so you can download them as a PDF. We also do have like hard copies available, so reach out if you want some copies of them. So a really good, breakdown of what is travel and transport in a, a visual format, as well as the buckets of funding and roles and responsibilities in the NDIS as well. We have a video series called Easy as Pie. This is hosted by the lovely Emily, and that breaks down a whole range of topics in great detail as well. So really worthwhile checking that one out too. So yeah, that's our contact information. Get in contact with us if you have any questions. And yeah, thank you for watching. Thank you for attending if you made it to the live session as well. On behalf of myself, Mark and Shannon and the team at NDSP, we greatly appreciate your engagement. And yeah, we look forward to answering further questions or engaging with you further.